Hello, everybody. Welcome to the SoxProspects.com podcast. We are the web's number one source for information on the Boston Red Sox farm system from top to bottom, from Fort Myers to Pawtucket and all stops in between. Thank you for the listen. My name is Chris Hatfield. I am the executive editor of SoxProspects.com, and I am joined, as always, by our director of scouting, and not the only director of scouting on this episode of the podcast, Ian Kundle.
The far less important director of scouting,
I mean,
that we have on today.
I didn't want to say it.
No, you could say it. I completely agree with it.
Well, we're very pleased that today's episode is centering around an interview that we did with Red Sox. I guess technically not a director of scouting anymore, VP of amateur scouting, Mike Rikard, who you led me into embarrassingly mispronouncing his name before we started recording. Yes, it's your fault.
No, it's not.
Blaming it on you.
Go Garen Giacchini yourself.
The thing is, you said it right that time.
I know.
His brother actually just got DFA. I don't know if you
saw that.
Yeah,
you have to be a long-time listener to get that reference.
Yeah. But anyway, so a great interview.
It was Mike, a lot of fun.
Who, I guess we'll give people a full intro to him, but we just kind of wound up connecting on Twitter over something, and he said we should meet up to time, and I'm like, well, if you want to talk,
enough to take up the opportunity.
If you want to talk, I've got a forum we could do that in, and he was gracious enough to come on the podcast. So I've mentioned we've been trying to get some different guests on here, and he's one, and hopefully we can make it a regular thing with him. In the future. Great talk.
He's got a lot of experience, a lot of insight, and he's cool, kind of a look inside how the Red Sox draft process works. Yeah,
I mean, Mike, we may as well get into it with his background. Mike has been with the Red Sox now since 2000, I believe it is. He was an area scout with the Padres from 2000 to 2004. Joined the Red Sox as a regional cross-checker in 2005. Served in that position from 2005 to 2010, was a national cross-checker from 2010 to 2012, and he has been named the director of amateur scouting in 2014, or I guess technically, 14. His first draft as the director of amateur scouting was 2015. Was in that position 2 years and then got promoted to VP of amateur scouting in 2017. So he's basically run 4 drafts at this point. As you'll hear, we kind of give him a little bit of a hard time. His first pick as director of amateur scouting was Andrew Benintendi, which I don't know how you top that, honestly. But he'll keep trying, certainly. It's you got it.
That's the goal. I mean, that's a great way to kick off your regime.
Right. But, before that, he was a shortstop at UNC Greensboro. After that, he was an assistant baseball coach at Wake Forest. He's managed in a couple of summer leagues, including for a couple of years with Bourne and the Cape Cod League. And he comes from a family that's been in baseball. His father was a minor league catcher and coach for 12 years, his father, Bob Rikard, and his uncle, Coley Rikard, played for the Pittsburgh Pirates during the 1940s. I still don't quite get how the math on that lines up, but maybe I'll ask him about that next time. But it comes from a baseball family and kind of has parlayed that into being in the game for a while now, and is one of the top guys in the front office for the Red Sox now. And he's been with the Red Sox, for the 3 of the 4 World Series in this era, right? So certainly has been around for some very successful times for the Red Sox, and has some great stories for us about being a cross-checker with the club and seeing some guys in the Georgia area, for example. So, we talk about what it is that the department does, go through all of his drafts and get some stories out of him. Really a great interview. I'm really happy with it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention patreon.com/SoxProspects. If you like the podcast and want to support us, that's a great way to do it. We have certain benefits, and we're going to start adding some, I think, soon. I've got an idea for a pretty good one for our Patreon supporters coming up. I've got to get some feedback from Mike and Ian on that. But we want to shout out, as we always do, our $5 level Patreon supporters. That would be Sox Signatures, Kirby Miller, Kyle Kostick, and Tyler Woodrow, Jeff Trainer, David Nardone, Tim Harding, Ernest Shermer, Bill Stanton, Deb Kendall, Evan Kirkwood, Chris Fox, James O'Hara, Nathan Kenyon, Andrew Wallen, and Lendell Martin. And as always, we invite you to send your emails to podcast@soxprospects.com. As I always like to say, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, and hopefully this interview is something that you guys want to hear about. We're really excited with it. I guess really quick, Ian, do we have any news we should get into? I think really the biggest there's been some signings. Let's see. I don't know if Bryce Brent's became official since the last podcast. I'm fairly certain we talked about
I think so, because I'm looking at the dates, and he signed the 10th.
The official date was the 10th. The podcast was released before that, our last podcast, or I guess technically after.
No, it was the 12th.
It was the 12th.
I don't know when we recorded.
Well, we didn't talk about any news on the Spear podcast.
Okay,
but we did have a podcast that got released on
December 19th, which was way before.
But, well, at any rate, Bryce Brents is back. I'm pretty sure we talked about it then. But great to have him back to obsess over.
In Pawtucket.
Yeah. Hey, Bryce Brent's in Pawtucket forever, I guess. Some other minor league deals. Daniel Schlereth, former Diamondbacks and Tigers prospect, a reliever, has signed. I guess really the only other signing to a minor league deal since then would be the signing of, is it Jenry Mejia?
Yeah.
I thought it was Henry, but I guess Jenry.
Henry. I think it's Henry, but he signed today, I want to say.
He did. He did sign today.
He also hasn't pitched any games since 2015. But
yes, because he was suspended for his third positive performance-enhancing drug
He
test.
was kicked out of baseball for life. Yeah, but I guess he got an appeal.
Well, you get to apply for reinstatement after a year, and the commissioner has the discretion to reinstate you. The lifetime ban has to be for at least 2 years. And I would assume if he ever got popped again, he'd be done. But Henry Mejia is back. I guess Ryan Weber on a minor league deal would have been one after the last podcast. But,
I mean, they're just loading up on bullpen guys, flyers.
Carson Smith, I think, was after the last one to a minor league deal. Although I think that's basically to rehab, because my understanding he's not pitching this year.
But I mean, it makes sense that they're just loading up on kind of shot in the dark guys, because you never know what's going to stick with the bullpen. I mean, guys can come out of nowhere like we saw last year with Ryan Brazier. So it's worth it.
Whole bunch of cuts.
Cleaning the deck for spring training.
Yeah, a lot of. This is something that's been new under the Dombrowski regime. I think under the Epps-Starrington regime, they would bring everybody into camp, which I get, and then maybe have several rounds of cuts during camp. Whereas I think now, what the Red Sox do is they'll release guys in January. It's nice because it gives them a chance to sign somewhere else. I know a couple of these guys some of these guys have already signed with indie league teams. For example, first baseman Trey Gans and right-handed pitcher Taylor Ahern were two guys who were cut this month, and they have already signed with indie league teams, I believe.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, there's some guys who can do a few things, but they were never going to make it with the Red Sox, at least, where they have other guys in those positions, specifically I think like corner infielders and stuff. So
Gans just got he was squeezed out basically.
That's
he
what
would have been a first baseman in Greenville this year, and as we've talked about, you've got Tristan Casas, you've got Nick Northcutt. In theory, you've got you definitely have Brandon Howlett there. Probably not Danny Diaz, but just you've got this swell of corner infielders coming up behind him.
Exactly.
Would have been tough to find him at bats. Any other cuts notable for you, Ian? One guy that I'll mention is Austin Glorious.
That's who I was going to mention. Just health.
It was a health thing. I mean, he missed all of last year. Oh, not all. He came back near the end.
The stuff wasn't back, though. And it's just, his delivery was really rough, and there were obviously injury concerns, and that's what happened, Pitchers get hurt.
Yeah. Good guy. From when we've talked to him. A guy who I think we were one of the first ones on. Really. After
he was really good pre-injury. He was really interesting, but it was, I think, in the 2017 season he got hurt, and it was kind of after that the stuff just didn't come back.
This injury he suffered during spring training.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. It was this year he got hurt, and then he just didn't come back. The stuff wasn't there.
But Good guy. We wish him the best of luck.
Exactly.
At all these guys.
I'm sure he'll get another shot.
Yeah,
so.
Some other interesting guys. I mean, Lucas Young was a guy who was drafted in 2017 who was kind of interesting. I think you had said he looked pretty good.
Yeah, he's like an potential like minor league depth guy.
Some other guy. I mean, Jordan Betts was a guy who'd been in the system for a while. He was really the only other high minors guy. That was. I guess Ryan Scott was a guy who had put up some pretty good numbers as a senior signee out of Arkansas Little Rock. He was a guy who was cut this year after hitting 194 in Salem this past year. Ramphis Baroa was a guy who had kind of been on the back of some top 60 lists for us.
Just 'cause he hit bombs.
Yeah, I mean, he had some pop. I'm kind of surprised they moved on from him so quick, but he struggled in Lowell this year. But you can see the whole list on the transactions page at Sox Prospects. A bunch of Dominican Summer League guys who never came over to the States, which makes sense. I mean, they've added so many guys the past 2 years that there was some culling that was going to happen there. So, you can find everything there. I think that's about it really in terms of news, Ian.
Yeah, there's not a lot going on not just with the Red Sox, with all of baseball.
Yeah,
it's making a lot of people very angry. But it's kind of we're in the slow period where in camp starts for some teams, unless I think 2 weeks. The A's are the first. I think it's mid February. So
yeah, it's less than a month.
It's coming quick.
And I mean, Bryce Harper's not signed.
Machado's not signed. Keitel's not signed. Craig Kimball's not signed. Yeah, there's a lot of guys still in play, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
When did JD Martinez sign last year? Was that February?
February. I think it was early February, though. Let me Google it.
No, I'm on the Sox Prospects transactions page.
Ooh, plug. Let's see who can find it first. I'm on BREF.
Do we even have it on here?
It should be on there.
Oh, yeah. February the 26th he signed.
So that was after camp had started.
Wow. I did not even realize it was that late.
It's going to be it's baseball. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this more as we approach. When's the CBA up? 2020 or 2021?
Yeah, there better be a strike because
the way it's going is not sustainable. I mean, it's just not sustainable the way it's going. Like, yeah, I'm sure we could spend probably an hour discussing it, and I'm sure you'd have some interesting takes as a lawyer.
Yes,
but
yes,
the way it's going, there's the disconnect between the players and the owners is only going to keep getting bigger, I think, and we're kind of seeing that again after people last offseason talked about how that was kind of a freak one-time thing, whereas it's the exact same thing is happening this year.
Same thing.
And we're it's interesting too, you're seeing like some guys take some weird-ish contracts, like that Whit Merrifield deal.
Yeah, that extension. Well, the thing is the contract buys out his last year of team control and all 3 years of arbitration. Which
is why I get it, but he probably left. I was reading an MLB Trade Rumors kind of discussion of it, and they think they left probably $8 to $10 million on the table. But I guess I didn't realize he's a 30-year-old guy who's still in his rookie year
and relies on speed.
So yeah, he wasn't going to be a free agent until he's 34 anyway. So I kind of get him cashing in, but still, it was just striking to see, Whit Merrifield, who I think he was an all-star last year, and he was I wonder how many WAR he put up. I think it was a lot. I was looking at it yesterday.
Yeah, he had a good year. I distinctly remember that he had a pretty solid
year. How many WAR? He was a 4.5 WAR player.
Fangraphs?
No. He was a 5.5. I'm on BREF. He was a 5.5 WAR player on BREF, and he got a 4-year, $16 million contract. Not
a bad deal for the Royals, and I mean, I guess when you're in his kind of unique situation, the security is probably a good thing.
Yeah, because I mean, as we were saying, he was going to be playing on the minimum this year, and then he had 3 years of ARB where his number was going to be so low because he was coming out of the minimum the first year. So
yeah,
he's basically taking more money this year and next year, but giving up some on the back end.
Right. Well, we'll definitely have to talk about that more in depth some other time. I should mention before I get tweets correcting me, Johnny Bladell, the outfielder who was in Portland this year, as well as infielder Carlos Tovar, who was with Salem this year, were also among the releases. I had said, the only other high minors guys and had not said them. So,
thank you, Statboy.
Yes, Statboy chimed in with that. So, all right. Well, let's just throw this to the interview, Ian, right?
Mm-hmm.
We were not going to record an outro, so thank you to Podcast Joe Tetrault for doing all of our producing. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Again, podcast at soxprospects.com with your questions. You can follow us on Twitter. Ian is at Ian Cundall, IANCUNDALL. I am at SP Chris Hatfield, and follow the site's account at Sox Prospects. We're going to start doing some on the Twitter account. I think maybe some preseason content leading up to spring training and the season. So, yeah, keep an eye out for that.
I was going to say, if you want to hear more of my voice too, I was on. I was a guest on the Over the Monster SB Nation, the Red Seat podcast, talking with Jake Devereaux about mainly minor league pitchers to watch out for this year who have a chance to help the Red Sox bullpen. So, if you're interested in that, we talked a lot about the guys who I think you never know. The Red Sox bullpen has a lot of question marks, and they've got some options internally. So we went in depth on a bunch of guys there.
The Over the Monster podcast.
Exactly.
That's a shout out to at least one specific person who I'm fairly certain will hear this. But at any rate, yeah, well, good. Go check that out. And here's our interview with Mike Rikard. We hope you all enjoy it, and we'll be back at you guys soon. No idea on timing,
soon-ish.
But yeah, soonish. Keep an eye out. Hopefully a couple weeks, I think. We'll try to get another one of these lined up. So here is our discussion with Mike Rikard. All right, we are now joined by our guest for today's podcast, and that is Mike Rikard from the Boston Red Sox organization. Mike, it's kind of funny. I don't get why we haven't talked until now. It seems pretty obvious thing to have you on, or at least to be talking to you more regularly than we get to. But thank you for joining us. We're pumped to have you on, talk some amateur scouting, talk about your career with the Sox, talk about some of the drafts you've been involved with and run for the Sox, and all things in between. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for making some time for us, man.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me, and likewise looking forward to discussing my role and our department and all those good things. And I do agree. It's kind of part of our ingrained culture now where we should have known each other and had these discussions a long time ago, but we follow each other on social media and kind of gotten to know each other in that sense. But yeah, it's been a long time coming. So happy to be here with you guys.
Excellent. Well, I guess we may as well start with how did we get here? As I discussed in the intro, you played at UNC Greensboro and got into coaching and then scouting. I guess, what kind of led you into that? Was this always, with baseball being something of the family business with your father playing and your uncle, was getting involved with baseball as a career always the goal? And at what point did kind of coaching and then scouting really become the direction you wanted to go in?
Yeah, I think I was growing up. I do come from a baseball family, and I probably had visions of grandeur like most kids and kind of the hope that you're going to be a player for a long time. And once I got to college and kind of started playing with guys that were considerably better than I kind of realized I knew I loved the game, and if I wanted to stay in it, I better kind of start considering, other pathways to do so. And so I started kind of becoming interested in coaching and looking into potential opportunities to kind of get my foot through the door on that in that way. And fortunately that worked out. My college assistant coach had played at Wake Forest University. And as soon as I graduated, I kind of kicked around playing in an independent league for a little bit. And then the opportunity came up to be a graduate assistant at Wake Forest University. So that kind of quickly that led me to becoming a full-time assistant. And during that time, I was managing in several of the affiliated college summer leagues, but 2 summers specifically in the Cape League, where I met a scouting director for the Padres, a guy named Bill Gayton. And I was making like $15,000 a year at the time, being the second assistant at Wake Forest. These are the old days of college baseball in the late 90s. And I remember he asked me, I know you're making great money at Wake Forest, but how would 46,000 sound to start as an area scout? And I probably could have taken advantage of him a little bit more, but I jumped on the opportunity right away. And that kind of led me to the Padres as an area scout, where I met Theo Epstein and Jason McLeod. And then fast forward, when they ended up in Boston, they brought me along with them, fortunately. And that was the right after the World Series in 2004. And I've been here ever since, with the Red Sox. So that's a little bit of the details on the career path. So.
And so obviously you moved up, as an area scout, and then, regional and national cross-checker, and eventually becoming director of amateur scouting, now vice president of amateur scouting. It's been a while with this one organization, starting with, as you said, the Theo Epstein era into the Ben Cherington era, and now with the Dave Dombrowski regime. But it does seem like the kind of core, more or less, of course, there have been guys who've peeled off. You mentioned Jason McLeod as a guy who's moved on along with Theo as well. And, people will know like Mike Hazen, Emil Sade, who was, I guess, in essence, your predecessor, directing amateur scouting and kind of running the draft, so to speak. But for the most part, guys who are with the Red Sox stay there until they kind of move up and out to get promoted to positions where, the Red Sox have guys running the show. Is that maybe part of an unsung part of the organization's success, where while things have changed a little bit at the top, this is a group of guys that has been together for a while, and is familiar working with each other. Does that kind of help you in your job, where you're not learning every year a different guy who you've got to work for, or different guys working around you? Or is that just kind of, maybe with success, that's what breeds those guys staying around?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we're all really fortunate to have here with the Red Sox is we've worked for, an ownership group that really values and supports the draft. And then, under the three general managers that I've worked for, they all, put great value on the draft as well, and consider it to be a huge part of the success of the organization. And in doing so, or on top of that, we've got some really, what we found to be valuable systems and processes and people, probably more importantly than anything, people in place that have kind of formulated the core of our staff. And I think it's one of the things in regards to scouting specifically that goes kind of undervalued at times, is that knowing your staff and the familiarity of knowing your scouts, and, the trust factors that exist when you're, dealing with each other. I mean, scouting is such a subjective thing, but once you kind of learn, the kind of traits of each person, and it's really a big part of it. And just kind of knowing how each other goes about their business. It's almost like sport, like playing too, right? Like you get to know your teammates and kind of know how they operate and what they do. And, when a certain scout says, I'm all in on this guy, I promise you he's going to hit, really kind of, how serious to take that, so those things are certainly a big part of, one of the reasons that we feel we've been able to have some success through the years. So
makes sense. And I guess we might as well get into, obviously, like we said, you're the VP of amateur scouting, and a lot of people probably know you, as popping up around draft time and being in charge of that sort of area of things. But for those out there who maybe don't know, what exactly, is the Red Sox amateur scouting operation? What are your responsibilities in your role in running that? How many people are we talking about? What's the coordination that happens there? What's really the operation in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, it's a big operation. I'll start there. One thing that's kind of happened with the landscape of the draft through the years is it's really become a year-long job. And so many times, with like the high school hitters, for example, seeing them out of their season is the best time to see them. So now we really kind of become, immersed in the summers of scouting the high school players, and that's kind of lengthened into the fall in recent years. So it's a big operation, and we have roughly 18 area scouts. We've got 4 national scouting supervisors who are responsible for seeing players throughout the country, but they're also overseeing the scouts and kind of participating in the development of each scout, which is a big task. And then we have a national cross-checker who's John Boer. We have a national pitching cross-checker, Chris Mears, and then we have a couple kind of pseudo special assignment type, positions with Mark Wassinger and Paul Fryer. So we do have a big staff, but I think when you work together and everyone's kind of pulling on the same end of the rope, you can find great value in the numbers, and it allows you to kind of get more looks or get deeper on certain scouts lists. And, we found, if you look back through the years, some of the players that we've been able to get a little bit deeper in the draft, one of the things that's, the scouts deserve credit on those later picks. And I think if you really look back through the years, you'll see we've done a exceptional job in getting quality prospects a little bit deeper in the draft.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I guess, a lot of people kind of think of the draft, the way I've always thought of it is, you've got the GM who may or may not be involved for like the first round, but then after that, you're just with the number of players that you have to line up to make 40 picks. I mean, when you get to a certain point, is it literally just, how do you figure out who you're grabbing in, say, the 20th round, right? Like, how is it, is there a big board? Is it, hey, someone speak up, who should we grab here? Or is there a short list of guys that you've always got on hand as the draft goes along? And where does that start? Are you starting to talk about guys in the spring? Are you starting to talk about guys the previous fall?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The draft, in my opinion, is probably too long. But once we do get into the later rounds, you go to the people that are kind of pounding the table for certain players that are still available. And one of the kind of interesting kind of caveats to that is my comfort level typically kind of leans to the side of the scout that knows the player the best. Like we have some scouts that, even though they're 20th round type players, have done all their homework and they've seen them, a number of times, and they know their coaches and they have background information in on their character and some of those things. And so when you're trying to kind of separate a group of players that are typically lesser players, like Brandon Howlett's a great example in this past draft of a guy that Stephen Hargett, our scout, was, he doesn't call me with these calls, but he's calling our cross checker like relentlessly and kind of banging on the table. Like, we need to take Howlett. Don't let him go another round. And when those type of, when that intel gets back to me, then, that's the kind of player that you kind of elevate and, kind of you do make sure you get, because, you really know that the area scout's convicted. And that's what good area scouts do. When you get, as the draft progresses, it evolves into more of an area scouts game. And again, like the Christian Vasquez's and the Josh Reddicks and the Hunter Stricklands and the Mauricio Dubons and the, those type players were all kind of, the pedal was pushed the hardest by the area scout. But it's a lot. The draft, there's so much information, and balancing that information and kind of determining which direction to go it's a tall task. And, that's why you need a lot of good people in the trenches with you to help make these decisions. So.
One thing that you mentioned that I hadn't really thought too much about, but that I've thought about previously, is you mentioned development of your area scouts. And it's always been kind of interesting to me where teams will hire a guy, send him out there to see these players and just kind of trust them almost. And obviously trust gets built over time, but I've always kind of wondered how that development works, and it seems like that's something that you guys have thought about. How does that work with the scout? Whereas, with a player, obviously you're working on tools and skills and things like that, and you're going to teach a hitter to hit, you're going to teach a pitcher to pitch. But with a scout, what does that development look like, and what kind of work are you doing with them in terms of, I don't even know what it would be.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's one of the things, and this goes kind of back to when I first arrived with the Red Sox. We valued it at that point too, and it was the regional cross-checker's responsibility. That was my first position with the Red Sox, and I was expected to go to great measures to kind of participate in the development of each person. And so if you have veteran scouts, it's not as much the development, but it's more about the deeper discussions about each particular player and kind of putting your heads together and trying to get to the right answer, so to speak. But some of the things that we do, like we have a scout school, our own Red Sox scout school each fall. And essentially what we'll do is we'll invite, certainly our newer scouts, but sometimes, some others, and we'll get together with the cross-check staff and 3 or 4, of our area scouts. And basically we'll talk scouting for 3 days in Fort Myers, and we'll talk about writing reports. We'll talk about experiences where we've made mistakes and why, and, a lot of that. And it gives the opportunity for the new scouts to kind of, we'll just sit down real casually, with some pizza and, beers or whatever, and just say, hey man, what are you not, kind of understanding? Is it your report writing? Is it looking at pitchers' deliveries? And that can, those conversations kind of morph into a myriad of different things, and it's all very, very productive. So that's a big kind of development piece that we consider to be valuable. Another one is we do reviews, like we do staff reviews on each employee, and those can be very challenging for me because I conduct them, and in some cases I don't spend a whole lot of time with each individual. But what it does is we try to kind of put together some constructive feedback for each person, and it gives them a chance to kind of voice, any things that they want to say too. And so you kind of, again, kind of same thing. You're kind of putting your heads together just to say, hey, what are you going to improve on this year? What did you think you struggled with last year? And it just really opens up, lines of communication, very productive, conversation. And I, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like, through those processes, people get better and you get a better understanding of each other and you learn things. And so those are just a couple of them. And then, like I mentioned, we used to call them our regional cross-checkers. Now they're called our national scouting supervisors, and they're responsible for basically overseeing, a group of scouts. And, so they're reading their reports every day. They're providing feedback. They're talking, really more intimately about certain players that sound interesting. And, like I think back when I was first hired with the Padres, just how much different it is. To give you an example, we had a scouting director, a first-year assistant scouting director, and one national cross-checker, and that was it. Like I was a first-year area scout, and I had North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and I think there were 6 or 7 first-rounders that came out of that draft, and my head was spinning so fast. Like I was just trying to get to a game and I was completely overmatched, but like the good thing is I learned very quickly. But I didn't have people helping me along the way and kind of trying to work in my development case. So I kind of learned on the job, which is a different way of going about it. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I can imagine how your head might spin. I'm trying to think, that would have been the 2001 draft, or would that have been the 2000 draft, your first year?
2001.
Okay,
2001.
So that's the Teixeira was probably the top guy in your area?
Yeah, and Jeremy Hermida, Jeff Francoeur, I think McKay McBride, Josh Burris, I think Richie Lewis, the second baseman at Georgia Tech, went in the first round also. So, I mean, it was really a big draft specifically for the state of Georgia. I think Clemson may have had a first rounder that year, maybe Patrick Boyd. Actually, Patrick Boyd did not go that high, but he was kind of an enigma type college hitter, but there was a ton of really good players in that draft.
Well, and that's a huge area. I mean, now you guys would have what, 2 or 3 guys covering that area now instead of one guy?
We do. And that kind of, I feel like it was maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago where a lot of the teams kind of started cutting back on the areas. That scenario with the Padres was very common at that time. It wasn't just us. I mean, a lot of the amateur scouting staff just were smaller, and people kind of over the course of time really, in my opinion, probably just started to realize how important the draft was. And, you know, as certain teams kind of were ahead of the curve, whether it was with, you know, video or, you know, more personnel or hiring more cross-checkers or, you know, pitching cross-checkers, which has kind of been something that's kind of, you know, come on the scene in the past few years. But people really started bolstering up their staffs, you know, maybe 10 years ago. And at the same time, they started kind of lessening their area scouts areas, you know, which makes sense. And we've done exactly that as well. So we have an area scout now that covers North and South Carolina. And we also have one scout that covers the state of Georgia. So.
Makes sense to me. One thing we wanted to do with you, Mike, is kind of go through your drafts as the either director of amateur scouting or VP of amateur scouting, and you know, maybe just focus on a guy or two from each of those. And you know, your first draft as director of amateur scouting was 2015, and your first pick that you get to make. I guess the question is. I don't mean this in a negative way, but did you peak with the first pick that you got to make as a director of amateur scouting with Andrew Benintendi at 7? Because
I hope not.
Obviously, you hope not. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely got off to a great start. For sure, there's no denying that. But the goal would be to find more similar guys like him. I know that's a tall task, but that's what we're expected to do, and that's the plan moving forward. So
yeah, I mean, and that was such a weird situation where, I mean, the way it's been reported, and I don't know how true this was across baseball for every organization or not, but it was the teams didn't realize coming into the year that he was a draft eligible sophomore. At what point did you guys know he was draft eligible, I guess, and just his rise? At what point did it become clear if he's there, we're popping him?
Yeah, well, I mean, to start, our scout, Chris Mears, he did an excellent job. He was aware of his status, and he actually liked him as a player. We had good reports on him out of high school, and he was someone that Chris had interest in coming into the year, despite the fact that he didn't have a great freshman season and, you know, he didn't play summer baseball. So we really kind of coming into the spring, we knew he was kind of a quote, interesting, you know, we knew he's athletic and he had some tools, but he hadn't really done much yet. And Chris, you know, took the initiative to get him cross-checked. And as soon as we started kind of accumulating more reports on him, people started coming out of there like Jimmy Robinson, our cross-checker, and then John Boer, our national guy. Both of them right away stuffed him right in the first round. And I remember reading the reports and almost falling out of my chair because I just, at the time, this is early in the spring, I'm looking kind of back through his portfolio and I'm like, wow, he's really small. He didn't hit much as a freshman and he didn't play in the summer, and these guys want to take him in the first round. And so, you know, it's really interesting story, but such a great credit to, you know, probably more so than anyone else, those three individuals that I named, and they really rang the bell and they put us in a position to kind of get out in front of the industry on him. And, you know, then I was able to see him numerous times, just because, you know, it is big, my first pick. And, like his size was something that we thought and discussed a lot about. And, when you don't see a player ever swing a wood bat, that can be, that can kind of add some trepidation into the process as well. But it was really just a good kind of staff process. And, fortunately, it looks like we made a really, really nice pick there. So.
Mm-hmm. And got a couple other, major leaguers out of that draft as well, and Ben Taylor and Bobby Pointer, and certainly some other guys who will come up still with, if you look at a Logan Allen, who's in top 100 lists right now. So certainly a good start for you. I guess, what lessons did you learn coming out of that draft, that you carried over into 2016 and since? Was it, was there a certain learning curve to it, that being, kind of the director of amateur scouting at that point, that you learned new things from it? Or was it just kind of another draft and I just happened to be the guy at this seat at the table as opposed to this other seat a couple away?
No, I mean, I think anytime you go through something for the first time of that magnitude, you learn a lot. I mean, this job is challenging, and there's so much depth to it in so many ways. Like, I'm constantly learning. Like, I learned something this week, right? And going through the draft specifically, I mean, you can always look back to certain picks or our process and on certain players and stuff, and maybe try to learn something from that. But I don't know of any kind of particular case specifically to point to, but I know that there are certainly some lessons that were learned that have kind of benefited us since.
Well, certainly not to necessarily just only talk about first rounders, but the 2016 draft, really the thing that stands out about that, of course, as well, is the first rounder picking at 12 and getting Jay Groom at 12, a guy who, going into the draft, on the one hand, he's rated as the top talent in the draft by some outlets, and is certainly a consensus top 5 talent in the draft. And then at the same time, there's these, there's certain rumblings of off-field issues, some that were reported at the time, some that weren't. And we've certainly gone into those here on the podcast, and we don't need to go into the ones, again, just the ones that have been public, of course, at the time or later. But you've got an opportunity to draft that kind of talent at 12. I guess, did you have any idea going in he might be there at 12? And, as far as the scouting of him, being comfortable with whatever these off-field whispers were, the character there, and how'd that process work out? And were you guys as surprised in the room as we may have been watching it on MLB Network?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably, going back to lessons learned, one of the things that I learned as a cross-checker is that you can never really kind of assume a player's not getting to your pick. There's always maybe a couple, 2 or 3 cases in each draft that you can kind of go, no way would he get to 12. But with a high school pitcher, the good lesson, and I'm happy that we did have a really kind of complete process in his case, and we were prepared to consider him should he get there. As we kind of were leading up to the draft, there were some rumblings that, maybe his name wasn't, kind of showing up as in front of us really, in a solid way. And so we obviously, we had scouted him. We had a good process with him. We had an area scout that believed in him. We had a room full of people that, thought he was arguably the best talent in the draft at that point. So when he got to our pick, it was, quite honestly, it was an easy decision. I mean, we've always kind of remained in the business of taking the best talent, regardless of demographics. And, as I did mention, our scout, believed in him in a lot of ways and, stuck by him as far as, some of the rumors that were out there. And, I'm very excited about seeing him get healthy and get back on track to being the prospect that we believe he's going to be.
For sure. Makes sense. And I guess, we did kind of get into this a little bit, but, 2017, you're now the VP of amateur scouting. At least I believe that's when the title change happened. But maybe the bigger thing is now there's a new boss in town in Dave Dombrowski. Did anything change on your end when the new regime took over? Because it was interesting to me the way that Dombrowski came in and basically kept everyone that wanted to stay. And, the only people that left was the next year when Mike got the job in Arizona, Mike Hazen, and took a couple people with him. But anything change on your end? Was there any, sometimes guys will get drafted, and I think the one that comes up most is right-hander who throws hard. That's a Dombrowski pick, which, of course it'll be like a 10th round guy or something that he probably had nothing to do with. But I guess, does anything change on your end, or was there anything that noteworthy changed at that point?
No, it really didn't. I mean, fortunately, when Dave came in, he really kind of did quite the opposite. And from day one, he gave everybody a very fair chance to kind of prove themselves. And again, fortunately, we did. And he really empowered us. It was very easy to see, right away how much he valued scouting. And he trusted me as the director of the staff when he really didn't have to. It's obviously he was well aware of what an important position I hold. And, he empowered me to do my job. And, it's really been a pleasure kind of working underneath him. He's got so much experience in regards to the draft, but he also lets you do your job and has been very, very supportive, really in all facets in regards to the draft.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I guess the thing that kind of stands out to me looking the year ahead in 2018 is just, of course, it's very, very soon to be evaluating a draft just months later, but we've loved this draft, and certainly a number of guys, the ones that haven't necessarily been, a couple of examples at the top of guys being a little bit snake bitten with injuries, but certainly with the guys who've been on the field, there have been some great performances and some that were surprising. In terms of lining up a full draft, at what point is it that, is it the board falls a certain way, or are there certain things you'll look for going into a draft? Of course, we get questions all the time. Should the Red Sox draft more pitchers because they need to develop pitchers? And our answer is it's always best player available, almost. But at some point, as the draft board's lining up a certain way, are you more inclined to go another way, or is it just always best player? We're going to go this way, and then at the end, it's just kind of the way you look back and, all right, I really like how that shook out.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's you have to get a little bit lucky. I do believe that you kind of create your luck in a lot of ways. But, we felt good coming out of that draft as far as how things kind of fell. I always like to never kind of plan to have a good blend of players, but it's always nice when you kind of get, various types of demographics coming out of each draft. And then, probably worth noting too, when you have a couple of players that are, maybe a little bit more than kind of what you're expecting them to be, that's always nice. And that was certainly the case with Duran and Howlett specifically, and Shugart even to a certain extent. Stuff really kind of ticked up once we got him. But I do think it's important while we're, you sit here today and some guys had some really nice debuts. Some guys appear to have some, really impactful talent. It's you always kind of have to be cognizant of the fact that they haven't even, participated in their first full season. And I think we've all seen, guys that you're anticipating doing a lot kind of take a step back, and then we could sit here next year at this time and there'll be some players that have kind of jumped on the scene ahead of those guys. So you have to be careful, but certainly that it appears that we've got some good talent, and certainly, as you mentioned, with Cassis and Decker, not really having the opportunity to show themselves. And, this past season, really excited about getting them into the fold and healthy and playing full time. So,
And I guess, obviously you guys have plenty to do with going ahead almost immediately and scouting the next year's class, but how much do you follow up on guys that you come into the organization, both in terms of maybe, reviewing processes and stuff like that, but also in terms of, development. If sometimes a guy will back up, sometimes a guy will jump ahead. How much do you guys kind of help with the player dev staff of, we saw this, maybe try this, or are you just kind of hands off at that point? That's player dev's job. That's Ben Crockett and his team.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, their job, and we, once we kind of get them out in the field, they kind of take the reins. But it is important for us to kind of maintain a constant kind of, communication in regards to that. What we'll do before they all start their season is we'll have meetings, and we'll kind of pass off all of the information that we put together kind of before, selecting the players, just so player development kind of has an idea where, for example, where a pitcher's at with his pitch mix and kind of what direction we feel he's headed, and, are there any concerns to be aware of? So all of the information that we kind of accumulate through the years is passed on, and that's, that kind of gives them a starting ground for their development plan as far as, maybe things they're going to be working on, or things to be aware of, and that type thing. So, and as you guys know, with all the kind of information and pitch data and some of those things that's out there, it's become even more important at this point, because, you can really kind of find some competitive edges if you can tap into the right things, with pitchers specifically. So it's a big part of it. And Croc and I work, very well together, and kind of, if he has any questions about maybe what a player had done previously, he can always give me a call, or if I see something when I'm, either watching on video or out in the summer scouting, our own players, then I'll always kind of just provide my opinion to him, and, let the player development experts kind of handle it as they see fit. So that's typically how the process works, and it's what we do.
Nice. And then I guess 2019, obviously the draft that you guys are getting ready for, sort of an interesting challenge where, you came in with maybe some higher picks than the Red Sox are used to having. This upcoming year, between the club winning the World Series, which is, of course, I'm sure your take on that would be I'll pick as late as you want in exchange for a World Series. But then also with the 10-spot penalty for the competitive balance tax, I believe the first pick you guys are going to have is number 43.
That's correct.
How does that change things on your end, if at all? And, obviously there's certain other things that come with that in terms of cap money and stuff like that too. But does that change your preparation at all for the upcoming draft?
Yeah, it does a little bit in kind of how you attack your scheduling. I mean, you don't want your cross-checkers out spending time on certain players that, we kind of are pretty certain that aren't going to get to our pick. But, like I mentioned before, it's in most cases, the better college players kind of typically go where you think they're going to go. But in the case of many of the high school players, you just don't know. It could be a signability issue. It could be something that comes up really late. So kind of making sure that we have a good process, and really every case is important. It can be challenging, because if you think a player, for example, is going to be a 10 to 20 type player, and then you're kind of wasting days scouting him, it's tough, because it's a lot of work and in getting there, but you do have to be prepared for really any scenario. So trying to be strategic and not waste days, and make sure that, our staff is in the right spots and seeing the right players, and can be a lot of work, and it's really kind of tasking just staying on top of all that. But that's what makes the draft fun, and trying to get an edge and seeing the right players.
Sounds right. Well, I know we're kind of, I shouldn't say running up against the time we told you we'd take with you. We're well over, but I guess one or two last questions here. One, do you have your best publicly releasable scouting story of any time since you've been working as a scout where, a player you saw or something who nobody knew about, or anything like that? Or do you have any, kind of best story that comes to mind from your days out on the scouting trail, or in one of your maybe more front office type jobs?
Yeah, that's one that kind of comes to mind, and I'll give you a little bit of the short version. But when I was the regional cross-checker doing the Southeast, we had a scout in Georgia, Rob English, kind of a legendary old-school scout that had been around for years, signed a ton of major league players. And Rob, I kept going into Rob's area. This was my second year, I believe it was second or third year cross-checking, and I was, as the cross-checker, you want to go in and always see the first round, the top guys. And he kept telling me, he's like, no, I don't. It's like, don't worry about those guys. I want you to come see this kid down at this junior college in Middle Georgia. And I'm reading the report, and I'd never even heard the name. And, I'm trying to do my due diligence on all the so-called famous guys. And he was just so adamant. He literally wore me out with all this talk about this player. And so finally I go down and see him, and he's like a 60 runner with a really good arm and a really, really good bat speed and power. And it turns out it's Josh Reddick. And, we ended up selecting him obviously in the 17th round. And so that was just kind of a story that was just really a credit to good area scouting and what that can mean to an organization. And Rob actually did almost an identical scenario the following year with another high school pitcher there in Georgia. That kind of same deal. I was wanting to go see all these other guys, and he goes, please just come with me and see this one kid. And turns out it was Hunter Strickland. And so it's just really hard to get major league players. And, after the first few rounds, and for him to be able to do that kind of twice if you would have asked him on his whole list in both cases, what one player do you want and where can you get them, he would have said Reddick and then Strickland. And we got both, after the 15th round. So it's pretty impressive. And again, just such a great story for the value of, good evaluating. And I'm proud of Rob too. Rob's our part-time guy for Brian Moeller there, in Georgia now, but over the years, he's played a really impactful role on our staff. So
yeah, it seems like he's been around for forever with these. I think since I've been doing this, I think he's been the guy down there. So that sounds right. Ian, you had a question you wanted to ask, and I think we'll close out with that. So make it good.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good one. So kind of in the baseball landscape, we're seeing like kind of the rise of two-way players getting drafted and getting the chance to play both ways. I'm thinking like the Rays have a few like Brendan McKay, Tanner Dodson. And obviously you guys have drafted a few guys in the past like Bobby Dahlbeck, Casey Kelly, whereas in Kelly's case, he was given the chance to hit before switching to pitching. And then Dahlbeck's case, he went straight to hitting. What is the process like when you're scouting like a two-way college guy or a two-way high school guy? And how early on in the process do you determine if you're going to commit, if you draft them, you'd like to commit to either one direction or another, or in the case of potentially in the future, like giving them a chance to do both in pro ball?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think kind of the genesis of the process in most of the cases where we've had players that are kind of fit that mold is kind of first off trying to figure out what we like them better at. And then the next piece, is typically, the scout figuring out what the player really wants to do, right? Like, what is he most passionate about? Asking the player and kind of trying to get to the bottom of like, what do you, if it's one or the other, which would you really want to do? And in most of the cases that I've dealt with personally, we kind of get to that. Like in Bobby's case, he was adamant about being a hitter, and that he wanted to prove himself as a hitter. And so it was never really much of an issue. And we haven't, I can't really go back to a player that we've really been on that's, really kind of wanted to do both. But I know other teams have the instances that you pointed to. But our thing is typically, and I'm sure we would I guess maybe be open to that type of situation if there was really kind of a two-way talent that kind of deserved that type of opportunity, but haven't really dealt with it to this point.
Hey, cool. I mean, if Rick Porcello can double off of Max Scherzer, why bother developing hitters at all, right?
That's right.
So
That's right.
Awesome. Well, Mike, we've loved having you on, and we'll definitely have to do this again. Maybe sometime, maybe a little after June when things get a little quieter for you from this year's draft class. We can have you on and talk about that or something. But it's been a pleasure. We hope to see you around the fields at some point this season or in the near future. But at any rate, it's been a pleasure. And hopefully it won't be too long before we do it again. So
yeah, I look forward to that, guys. Appreciate you. I appreciate you having me on.
All right. Thanks, man.